Welcome back to Brigham Young University Hawaii's online economics course. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 5, Macroeconomics, the big picture. We're going to focus on the big picture trends, definitions, and ideas. It's fairly simple, very few equations, and hopefully it will make sense after we're done with this video. So today, macroeconomics, the big picture. So let's get started with the learning objectives. We're going to define real gross domestic product and explain how its calculation avoids both double counting and the effects of changes in price levels. We're going to identify the phases of a business cycle. We're going to relate business cycles to overall long-run trend in real GDP in the United States. So let's get started. We'll start with the business cycle. All a business cycle is an economy's pattern of expansion and then contraction, and then expansion again. It's interesting to note that in historical periods, we would have periods where the economy would start growing, we would extend credit to businesses, they would expand their factories and begin to produce more and more products. Well, you reached a point where sort of the expansion got tired, got exhausted. We had expanded a little bit too much. We'd expanded beyond the capacity of consumption to consume all the goods that we could now produce, and so we started to go into a recession. And the recession would take us down again. And then all of a sudden consumption would catch up with us. And then we would start going into an expansion again. So what you see in the business cycle is an economic pattern of expansion, contraction, and expansion again. Nominal GDP, remember GDP is gross domestic product. Nominal GDP is the total value of final goods and services for a particular period, valued in terms of prices for that period. Real GDP is the total value of all final goods and services produced during a particular year or period, adjusted to eliminate the changes in prices. When you think about it, if we make and build 10 homes in 1980, and we say, well, we built 10 homes in 1980 and it was $100,000 a home, that was $1 million worth of business. Well, today we build 10 homes, $100,000 a home, and it's also $1 million in total business. But are those $2 million the same? They're the same in total numbers. They're each $1 million, but prices have changed. The cost of lumber has changed. The cost of wiring has changed. The cost of concrete has changed. All these things have changed over this multi-year period. And what that means is the $1 million today is not nearly the same as $1 million 10 or 20 years ago. So that's the difference between nominal and real GDP. So we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail, but first we're going to hit the business cycle, make sure we understand it. An expansion is a sustained period where real GDP is rising, and real GDP is the GDP that is adjusted for inflation. So an expansion is a sustained period in which real GDP is rising. A recession is a sustained period in which real GDP is falling. A peak is a point of the business cycle at which the expansion ends and a recession begins, and the trough is a point of the business cycle where the recession ends and an expansion begins. So if you look at a picture, this is what you typically see as a depiction of a business cycle. We have this period of expansion. Here we have a peak. Then we have a recession starting. Then we have a trough. And then we have expansion starting again. Then we have a peak, recession, trough, expansion. Now the reality is it's not nearly as neat as this picture. They are very volatile. Big highs, big lows, sometimes small highs, small lows. Sometimes there's a big gap between them. Sometimes there's a very small gap between them. So it's not nearly as easy to predict or as simple to look at as this depiction. But that's generally how they work. So let's talk about how the business cycle relates to real GDP. If you were to look over history, you see from 1960 onward, we have this line here, which is gross domestic product. Then you have these little shaded areas were periods of recession. Those are recessionary periods during the U.S. economy's history. What's interesting is that if you would have taken this graph back to the 30s during the Great Depression, prior to 1930, in the Great Depression, all recessions were called depressions, whether they were small or large. The Great Depression was so significant that we decided, you know what, that's where we deserve to use the term depression. Everything else pales in comparison to the depression. So we're going to call those recessions. So that's where the word recession came from. But what you can see is if you look at this line of GDP, you can see that when you hit a recessionary period, there's a drop in the growth rate of gross domestic product. And that's typical for recessionary periods. Let's talk about price level changes and how to understand them. Learning objectives here are to define inflation, deflation, explain how the rates are determined, and articulate why price level changes matter. Explain what a price index is, and outline the general steps in computing a price index. And there's lots of different price indices. Number 3, to describe and compare different price indexes. Number 4, to explain how to convert nominal values to real values, and explain why it's important to make this calculation. And the last one, number 5, is to discuss the biases that may arise from price indexes that employ fixed market baskets of goods and services. We'll also add a few other sort of interesting contextual ideas to the idea of inflation and what's happened to it over the last 15 years. All right, so let's get started with this section. Inflation is an increase in the average level of prices. Consider a gallon of milk. If 5 years ago a gallon of milk was $3 a gallon, and now it's $5, inflation is the increase in the price for that gallon of milk. That's all inflation is. What's interesting, though, on an economy-wide basis, is what inflation does. It redistributes wealth. It creates uncertainty and consequently reduces lending. You can see how it would redistribute wealth because those whose incomes are tied to inflation are okay because their incomes are going to go up as inflation goes up. So they're largely held harmless. Those whose incomes are not tied to inflation, typically those who are poorer, those who are wage dependent, those incomes that are not tied to inflation tend to do poorer. Prices have increased. That gallon of milk is now $5 a gallon. Their salary hasn't gone up. They're still making $7.25 at the PCC. So their money, their income, doesn't go as far as it did before. That gallon of milk is more expensive, and their pay has not increased. Now, in reality, what happens over time, as inflation increases, slowly behind it, wage rates also tend to increase. But it's slowly, and it doesn't take place in lockstep with increases in inflation. And so that's why we redistribute wealth during inflationary periods. It creates uncertainty because if I don't know what the price of a good or service is likely to be in a year, or 2 years, or 3 years, that's uncertainty. And with that uncertainty, I'm less likely to take long-term risks like lending somebody money because I don't know what the long-term scenario is regarding prices. The last one, which is really interesting, is that it hurts lenders and benefits borrowers. The reason why is that if you lend somebody money, you lend them $100,000, that's not adjusted for inflation, is it? So just for example, I borrow $100,000 from you. I have my $100,000 today. I spend my $100,000. I buy a new Porsche 911. I have my car. I pay you back over 10 years. And we're fine with that on the first year because I pay you back, say, 6% interest. But what happens if inflation comes into the picture? If inflation comes into the picture and say inflation is 10%, I'm paying now the second year, my income is now 10% higher, but my loan is still based upon $100,000. Year 3, my income is another 10% higher. My loan is still $100,000. So the person who lended me money is behind, and me, who was in debt, is ahead. So what you sometimes see is governments who get themselves involved in significant debt, cannot pay off their debt, and so they try to inflate their way out of it by encouraging inflation to increase so that they can pay off their fixed amount of debt with inflated dollars in the future. So that's why it hurts lenders and benefits borrowers. Deflation is a decrease in the average level of prices. Again, this redistributes wealth in the opposite direction, but also it creates uncertainty. The uncertainty is created both in inflationary and deflationary periods because we just don't know what's going to happen. In this environment, it hurts borrowers and benefits lenders for the opposite reasons we discussed under inflation. Hyperinflation, which is very rare, but has occurred at some significant points in history, is an inflation rate in excess of 200% per year. You can see how that would be difficult to sustain. You may have seen some historical pictures of Germany just after the war years, where wheelbarrows full of cash were being taken to the bakery to pay for a loaf of bread. That's an example of hyperinflation. My first time I went to Brazil, which was in 1993, it was during a period of hyperinflation. And what we would do as Americans is not change our money into Brazilian currency until the second before we needed it, because the inflation rate was literally changing. The currency rate was up on the board, it was in electronic numbers, and it was moving fast. And so we were very, very careful not to exchange our dollars until it was absolutely necessary. Disinflation is just a decrease in the level of inflation. If inflation fell from 5 to 3%, that would become, or be called, a disinflationary number. And you know, what's interesting is over time, we've had relatively low inflation. And we've benefited from that, and the economy has benefited from that because our uncertainty went down. We didn't have nearly as much uncertainty. And because inflation was low, we were willing to lend, and borrowers were willing to borrow. And we had a fairly insignificant redistribution of wealth during this period. It's not unlikely that those days are over, that we're going to be moving into a period of higher inflation in the future. So why do we care? Here's an example in graphical terms of the inflation rate in the United States over a period of years. And what you'll see is that from 1960, where things tend to be fairly mild and relaxed, inflationary periods went up there, down and way up, down, way up again, down, and then we've had a long period of relatively modest inflation. What is interesting is that inflation is very hard to predict. The Federal Reserve stands ready at any time to try and use monetary tools, which we'll talk about later in the class, to try and keep inflation low. Because we have a sense that once inflation starts to pick up, it's very hard and very expensive to keep it back down. It tends to take off and have a life of its own. So let's talk about how we calculate that. We're going to do that through price indexes. A price index is just a number whose movement reflects the movement of the average level of prices. In order to generate a price index, we have to have a base period. We have to have a period where we say prices are higher than, and the then points to the base period. The base period is a time period against which the cost of the market basket, we'll explain what a market basket is in a second, in other periods will be compared in computing a price index. The consumer price index is a price index whose movement reflects changes in the price of goods and services that typically are purchased by consumers. So let's take an example of movies. And we can see movies in a number of different ways, one of which is through DVD rentals. And whether that's using Redbox or whether it's using some of the other more localized DVD rental places. We can also go to a movie. But if we go to a movie, certainly in our family, there are two other requirements, one of which is popcorn and soft drinks and other candy and other materials. We used to take our own candy into the movies. My wife purchased a large purse for this purpose. We would load it with food and candy and stuff. We'd take it into the theater. But now my son works for the theater, And he comes home with very sad stories about how they make no money on anything except for the concessions. And so now we go in and spend our money at the concessions so my son can keep his job. But if you were to try and create a price index for movies, you'd see that in 2007, we have a price for DVD rentals, a price for movie admissions, price for popcorn, a price for soft drinks, and we have a total market basket for 2007. Make sense? I think it does make sense. Problem is, prices change, and they'll change from year to year. So we take this same basket. This represents the basket of goods that we're going to spend, or of products that we're going to buy, and the money we're going to spend for that basket of movie goods. And what we're going to assume is that the components of that basket don't change. In other words, we don't all of a sudden say, I hate going to that movie theater. I'm not going to do that. I'm only going to rent DVDs. Or now we can stream everything online through Netflix, and so I'm not going to do any of this stuff. We don't change the market basket. And this is part of the problem. But what we do is we say that whatever market basket we had in 2007, we're going to have in 2008. So we keep the market basket constant, and then we say, well, the market basket cost me $48 in 2007. It now costs me $50.88 in 2008. The same products that I purchased in one year are purchased in the next year. So there's been some inflation. The inflation represented by $2.88 between 2007 and 2008. So if we're going to calculate this, all we do is say, well, what's the current cost of the market basket divided by the cost of the market basket in the base year? And in this simple equation, we're going to take the current cost, which is $50.88, divided by the market basket in 2007 of $48, and that's going to be our movie price index. And so our index is, between the 2 years, 1.06. Now how you'd interpret this number is interesting. It's basically a 6%, which is the 6 number here. It's a 6% increase in prices of your movie basket. All right, well, let's talk about a few of the indexes that we use. The implicit price deflator. It's a price index for all final goods and services produced. It's a ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP. So all you do is you take your total nominal GDP divided by your total real GDP, and that gives you the implicit price deflator. The personal consumption expenditures price index is a price index that includes durable goods, which are things that last more than a year, non-durable goods, and services, and is providing along with estimates for prices of each component of consumption and spending. There's a couple of others, but let's talk about the rate of inflation or deflation and how to calculate it. Now, we need to watch this formula because it's difficult based upon the words that are in here. What we need to do is we need to say, what is the change in the index divided by the initial value of the index? And this is going to be generated into a price for us, or an index for us that's in percentage terms. So for example, in the case of our movie inflation index, we went from 1 to 106. So 1.06 was our 2008 number. 1 was our 2007 number. So we take 1.06 minus 1.0, and we divide that by the initial value of the index, which is 1.0. What that gives us is an answer of 0.06, or 6%. So we've had a 6% increase in inflation of our movie basket. All right, the real value is the value expressed in units of constant purchasing power. In other words, in terms of what was the value of the goods in our base year. This is an adjustment for inflation. It says it's not just the value of the dollars expressed today, it's in terms of those dollars expressed today and what they can purchase in the same purchasing power of our base year. The nominal value is the value expressed in the current period. We haven't adjusted it for inflation. Okay, so The real value, in other words, the inflation-adjusted value of a number, is just the number divided by the price index at any time that our base is determined. Most price indexes that we deal with today were based into 1982. We expect that those indexes are going to be rebased to 1992 or some other year in the 90s in the fairly near future, but that hasn't been done yet. So let's talk about how to compute some of these real values using price indexes. Are price indexes accurate measures of price level changes? Well, that's a good question. The problem is, we mentioned this in our movie basket, the components of the market basket are fixed, and they don't account for changes in consumer behavior. For example, we now stream most of our movies real time from Netflix, so we don't rent DVDs as much anymore. So does the market basket account for that? No, it doesn't. It doesn't account for that at all. So we're still measuring something, which is the market basket with DVDs and going to movies in it, that don't reflect what's actually being purchased. And that's a problem. So new goods are excluded. Quality changes may not be accounted for. Indexes do not account for changes consumers make in terms of where they shop. One of the most interesting of these changes is the one that says quality changes may not be accounted for. And the reason why is you need to look at some things that were done during the Bill Clinton administration, where they created a new means of adjusting for inflation. And what we did is we said, you know what? We're not measuring inflation properly. Because what we're doing is we're increasingly buying better and better quality products, cheaper and cheaper, and that doesn't really account for the true value that's being generated. So what you do is you take an example of a DVD player. And you say, well, you know, when a DVD player first came out, it was $300 or $400. And it was pretty decent, but not really good, and nowhere near comparison to what you currently get in a Blu-ray machine. So what you've seen is the price of video disc players dropping dramatically, and the quality or the value of them increasing dramatically. And so the Clinton administration said, wait a minute, that's not fair. It doesn't truly adjust it or truly take into account the quality changes. So what we need to do is say, we need to adjust for what we're paying for things in constant quality terms back in the base year. So we say, what was the DVD player like in 2000? What is the DVD player like today? And we're going to say 2000 was our constant quality year. If it got better and more refined and better resolution, then we need to adjust that somehow in the prices. And there's good and bad to that type of idea, but it's been very, very hard to quantify. So if you were to look at some of the biases that we see in our inflationary numbers, what you'll find is that there's significant changes in the substitution of goods and services that we no longer use, and how much has that substitution impacted the individual rates of inflation. So you can look at the estimates that we've had for how much these biases impact it, and you can say, well, in 1997 and 2006, the substitution effect created a bias in our estimate of inflation of 0.4%. The change to new products and services in 2006 created a bias of 0.3%. Switching to different outlets, going to the outlet mall instead of going to Nordstrom's, things like that, that caused a bias in our inflation rate of 0.1%, for a total of 0.8%. So what you can see is that in reality we've had a inappropriate use of inflationary rates because we have focused on a market basket that didn't change. If we had changed the market basket, if we'd allowed these things to move a little bit, then our inflation rates would have been different by about 0.8%. All right, so we're done with inflation. We're going to talk about unemployment for a moment. Learning objectives here: explain how unemployment is measured in the United States, define 3 different types of unemployment, and then we're going to define and illustrate graphically what is meant by the natural level of unemployment and relate the natural level of unemployment to the natural rate of unemployment. So let's try and look into measuring unemployment. Number 1, the labor force. Now this is your only chance of being 16 years of age and older and being considered an adult. So the labor force is the total number of people 16 years of age and over who are either working or unemployed. The unemployment rate is just the percentage of the labor force that's unemployed. Now, here's an interesting diagram that walks us through how to calculate labor force and unemployment. Number one, is a person working? If yes, then they're employed. And we have an idea for just a number of people that would be employed, about 144 million. Okay, so if the person's working, yes, they're employed and they're counted. If the person is not working, we have to ask another question. Is the person looking and available for work? If the answer to that is yes, then they're considered unemployed. If the answer to that is no, then they're not considered to be in the labor force. This creates some very interesting problems. But for now, we're just going to focus on the fact that unemployment is those who are looking and available for work. The unemployed plus the employed are considered part of the labor force. The unemployment rate is just a calculation of the total amount of unemployed people here divided by the total labor force, which is here plus here. Okay, so what is the natural level of employment and the natural level of unemployment? It's the employment level at which the quantity of labor demanded equals the quantity of labor supplied. The natural rate of unemployment is the rate of unemployment that's consistent with the natural level of employment. That seems to be a little circular. So to be able to make sense of that, we're going to have to define a few more terms. We have an idea called frictional unemployment. Now this occurs because it takes time for employers and workers to find one another. In other words, if you were to get laid off, you're going to go home, and after you've cried in your beer, you're going to say, okay, I'm going to get myself up, I'm going to fix my resume, I'm going to start looking at the want ads, I'm going to look online, I'm going to try and find some jobs that fit with what I'm going to do, I'm going to send my resume out, I'm going to make some phone calls, I'm going to start setting up interviews, I'm going to have my interviews, and maybe I'll have to go back and forth a couple of more times. Eventually I'm going to get an offer, and then a few weeks after I get the offer, I'm going to start work. Well, the time between when you get laid off and when you start up work again can be months. And during that time period, you are willing and able and looking for work, so you're counted among the unemployed, but you don't have a job, and so you're looking for a job. So, frictional unemployment are just those people who are out of a job, looking for a job, and it's that rate of churn that exists in an employment market as people try and get reconnected up with a new job. Frictional unemployment. There's another idea called structural unemployment. And this is the situation that occurs naturally in economies that are undergoing significant transition. Structural unemployment results when a mismatch between worker qualifications and the characteristics that employers require. If manufacturing is going through fundamental changes and they're moving from individual employees screwing in screws and assembling things to using robots, what they need is good robot operators and no longer people who can screw things into motherboards. That's structural unemployment. There's a mismatch between worker qualifications and the characteristics that employers require. There's another one called cyclical unemployment, and this is the excess unemployment that exists during at the natural level of employment. In other words, remember our business cycle? We talked about those periods of recession. Well, during those periods of recession, we're laying people off, and then during periods of expansion, we're hiring people again. So some of that unemployment that exists there is not related to frictional, it's not related to structural, it's actually just cyclical. It's part of the business cycle that commonly occurs. All right, so let's try and define a little bit better the natural level of unemployment and the natural level of employment. The natural level of employment is quite easy. We have a demand curve for employment, we have a supply curve for employment. Where they meet is the market equilibrium for employment, which is here. So at that market equilibrium, we have this much quantity demanded of labor, and we have this wage rate for labor. Okay, so the natural level of employment is there, determined by the market. The employment rate the unemployment rate is particularly volatile over periods of time. But what you can see, which is very interesting, is that there's always a bit of a low associated with recessionary periods, and the recessions are these shaded vertical bars in the graph. And what you can see is that we have this period of unemployment, and then what happens? You have a recession. What happens to the unemployment rate? Peaks up during the recession, peaks up during the recession, goes up during the recession, goes up during the recession, goes up during the recession. So it's very common that unemployment rates will rise during recessionary periods. This is due to the cyclical unemployment that we just spoke about. That ends the discussion in this chapter, and we look forward to having you in the next discussion, and have a great day.